All right, so today in our class, we are going to wind up talking about that's it. We're gonna talk about why is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah where it is, and what in the world does it have to do with the story of Abraham, and what does it have to do with um, the promises of God, right? The reason we're going to talk about this story is that when we look through the lens of the Holocaust in particular, um, one of the questions that always comes up is what is remembered and why. So, any work that somebody would do, any kind of study one would do in the in on the subject of the Holocaust, other than just historical work on dates and times and places and things like that. One of the things we always get into is the question of memory and why are things remembered and why are things remembered the way they are, right? So when we bring that sensibility, right, into our setting of the scripture, and study of the Bible, and particularly the Old Testament, and particularly in Genesis, which is full of stories, right? One of the questions we have to ask is what, out of all the things that could be remembered, why are the things that are in the book of Genesis the specific things that are remembered, right? Um, there's a lot of things that could be told that are alluded to, um, but not developed, right? And so when we look into particularly something as iconic and as important as the character of Abraham, one of the things that this way of reading causes us to do is to think about, okay, we know Abraham's an important figure. Abraham is drawn upon in the Old Testament and in the New. Abraham is a person that God chose through whom nations would be blessed. That is a through line, right? That goes all the way through the Old Testament through Christ, through the New Testament reflection through Paul. So it's a really important figure. So when we go back to the origin stories, right, of Abraham, um, we want to find out, okay, so what do we know about him? Why is it important to know about him? What don't we know about him? What is told and what isn't told, right? Because we've all lived long enough to know that when we get to know somebody, we're getting to know somebody, we often have questions about what they're not saying, just as much as we are what they are saying, right? It's that in between, right? So there's some when we look at the story of with Abraham, which spans Genesis 12 to Genesis 25, right? So it's a block of text where when Abraham comes on the scene, and then when he kind of trails off in Genesis 25 with a whole nother family that we never talk about, right? He's got this other new wife and a bunch of new kids, and I mean, we don't know anything about that, which is really curious. But what we do know in these early stories is what we talked about last week, right? The story of Abraham, his wife Sarah, the promise that's made to Abraham that all nations would be blessed and that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. Right. Last week we talked about the fact that he and his wife Sarah are really old. Sarah concocts a plan by which he should have the child through her maidservant Hagar. Um, and when that happens, things go south really quickly. She throws Hagar out. God finds Hagar in the wilderness, blesses her, sends her back. And so, what we would expect really is the continuation of that story, which we get in Genesis 21 and then some in 22 when Isaac finally appears. But in the middle of that, the story of Abraham, we get this rather unusual story of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Like, what's that doing there, right? I mean, what does that have to do with anything of the story of Abraham, right? So it's a question. What's remembered and why? So what we're going to do is look at why this story is there, right? What's remembered and for whose sake and for what reason. So let's take a look. I've sort of mapped it out for you. Genesis 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, right? They all have to do with Abraham. They all have to do with some part of the covenant. Hagar appears in the first story, in the first part, and in the last part. Ishmael appears in 16, 17, and then again at the end. And then we have this, and Isaac comes in as a mention in 17. He shows up in 20 and 21 with the famous story of Abraham and taking him up for the sacrifice. And then we've got this thing of Lot, this story of Lot and Sodom, which is unusual, right? What's it doing here? Well, there's a joke in biblical scholarship about Lot, and it's a dad joke, okay? It's really bad. It's like when you're talking about Lot, you know there's a lot to talk about. I just think that's really, I think it's funny. But there is a lot to talk about. There is a lot to talk about. All right. So we have to talk about this Lot guy. Well, he shows up in Genesis 13 as Abraham's nephew, right? So Lot doesn't have anything to do with the promise made to Abraham on the surface, right? He's a nephew, right? He's not going to be part of the line in particular. But the thing that we do know about Lot is that there comes a point in time where Lot and Abraham are both herders of cattle and sheep. They're very wealthy in terms of what they own, and the land can't support both of them, and so they have to choose which way they're going to go, right? There's two places that can probably support them, and so they have to kind of part ways. And Lot decides to go to this really fertile area known as the cities of the plain, right? That's kind of the way it's told in Genesis 13. It's a very wealthy area. The land is good, the irrigation is good, it supports a lot of the cattle. It's a place where people can prosper. So Lot takes, really, it's the better part and gave Abraham the other part. Okay. We might argue that that was kind of a, maybe you could have deferred to your elder and given them the better part, but Lot doesn't do that. He takes it for himself. Now, the cities of the plain is a region that has these sort of different little city-state things in this big, nice, rich part of the land. And the cities of the plain is also the location of Sodom and Gomorrah, two of those cities, right? So we're kind of set up to see that Lot is somebody who chose to go to those cities. Now, Lot does not appear again, nor do the cities of the plain appear again until we get to chapter 18. And so as we work up to chapter 18, we've got the story we talked about last week. But in chapter 17, right, this is where God reiterates the promise to Abraham that all of his descendants would be blessed. And this is where I just made a list of these things here. The sign of the covenant is given, the circumcision, right? The sign of the children of the covenant. There's a name change. Abram becomes Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. And there's the promise of Isaac that is affirmed, right? That the seed of the promise would come through Isaac. And curiously, in 17, there is a statement in there where Abraham kind of pleads with God for it to be Ishmael, right? Oh, that Ishmael might live, right? So Abraham is like, well, when God says it's going to be, you know, Isaac that will carry the promise, Abraham is like, well, can it be Ishmael? And God says, no, Ishmael's going to be blessed, but Isaac is going to be the one, right? He's going to come through Sarah, right? So then there's this whole thing that happens where all this news gets back to Sarah and Sarah laughs, right? The story of Sarah laughing, kind of this sort of disbelief. The name Isaac, right, just as a marker, uh, is zakah, is the verb in Hebrew to laugh, right? And so Isaac, that verb can mean to laugh, it can mean to play, it can mean to party, it can mean all kinds of things, including what the people do around the golden calf in Genesis, which is revelry and dancing. And if you've watched the famous Ten Commandments, where Cecil B. DeMille interprets this, there's all kinds of goings on, right, around the calf. And literally in Hebrew, it says they are Isaacing around the calf. So this is a thick word that can mean all kinds of things, right? But here we're dealing with the laughter, okay? So at the end of chapter 18, that's where we have this break after Sarah laughs, and God says, should I tell Abraham what I'm going to do to the cities of the plain of Sodom and Gomorrah, right? So this is and of course now we know that Lot is in this area. Um, so the one thing that we need to put together pretty quickly is in the book of Ezekiel, which is a famous reference to Sodom and Gomorrah, it talks about the wealth of this area, right? This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters, meaning the other cities, had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and the needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me, therefore I removed them when I saw it. Right? This is a prophetic reference. But it gives a little bit of perspective on that economic prosperity and the fact that it was withheld, right? And that God saw that as a wicked thing, right? To have all this prosperous ease and not to share it. This is where Lot was located, right? So as we kind of move on to this story, it begins with God saying, how great is the outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah, and how very grave their sin. I'll be here, Ezekiel, for a little bit of information there. I will go down and see whether they have done altogether according to the outcry that has come to me, and if not, I will know it. So the last time we read about God going down to see something, right, we talked about this a little bit before, was in the Tower of Babel, right? Remember, God's going to go down and take a look, right? You have it here again. There's an outcry. And although it's not for today's discussion, we could ask the question, who's the outcry coming from, right? Is it the people of Sodom? Or is it the people outside of Sodom? The people in the plain? But there's some kind of cry that's going up to God, and God has to go down and investigate, right? So this is so this as it is at this point that Abraham starts doing something we've never seen Abraham do before, and that's bargain. Now think about all the times when he could have bargained and didn't. All right. remember we talked about this last week, Abraham is extraordinarily passive, right? So Sarah comes up with this thing about, you know what? I think the servants, your offspring is going to come through Hagar. So I'm going to send Hagar into you. I'm going to make her your wife, and I'm going to give her to you. And then you can do your thing, and then she's going to have the child, and that'll fix it. And then when Hagar does get pregnant with the child, Sarah's all upset because of the way um, Sarah has the way Hagar looks at her. We talked about that last week, and she throws her out. And Abraham says, "Well, she's your servant. You do with what you want." No defending her. We might have expected some kind of something, some kind of defense. We don't get any of that. At this point, we don't have any information about Hagar or what happened when she came back. We don't know any of that. What we do know is that Abraham did make up some sort of limited argument about Ishmael. And now here we have we have Abraham bargaining with God about Lot, a nephew, right, who isn't connected to this promise. He may be connected to the economy. This could have to do with money, but we don't know that. What we do know is that Abraham is now very, very vocal about, and the question that Abraham asked God is a really important one. Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked? All right. This is a huge question. And there's a term for it, right? It's called theodicy, which is the justice of God, right? And it's a big question about does God differentiate in his judgment, in God's judgment, between the wicked or the righteous, or is this just a mass wiping out of a city, regardless of the difference between the righteous and the unrighteous, right? So this is a really loaded question, right? And it's the first time that this question about God's justice comes up in the scripture. This is why it's important, right? So Abraham begins to bargain. If you find 50, will you destroy it? No, for 50, I'll keep it. What about 40? What about 30? What about 20? What about 10? All right, we go all the way down to 10, and God says, well, okay, if I find 10 people, then I won't destroy it. Okay. Now, in the rest of the story, this is where we get the grisly part about, the townspeople, wanting to, have sex with the people, with the angels that are visiting, that Lot has given his house to. And then instead of giving them the angels, now the word in Hebrew for the people that want to have sex with the angels that are in Lot's house is it's the word that means all the people. It's not a differentiated word for men and women. And the people come. So it's all of them. Anyway, Lot offers the daughters. All kinds of problems with this, right? But it's at that point that we know is that God is going to destroy the city. Okay. And the angels want to get Lot out of the city. And the only people that make it out or that leave are Lot, the two daughters, and the wife. That's 4. Not 10. Right? So, the city's going to be destroyed. One could argue that, well, if it's just 4, how come Lot gets a pass here? Right? Isn't he part of the city? Right? Is God somehow differentiating apparently God is differentiating by bringing Lot but the question is why, right? The agreement was 10, right? But there's not 10. So the city's got to be destroyed. But yet Lot and his wife and his two daughters are ushered out by the angels, although perhaps a bit reluctantly. The wife turns back, right? She, that story, turning into the pillar of salt. And so the question then that comes up in this story is, on what basis was Lot delivered? Okay, what was the reason for that? And what does that reason have to do with the wider storyline of Abraham and the promise and the blessing? Okay, this is where it gets important. It's because, right? So it was that when the cities of the plain were destroyed, God, what? What's the word? Remembered. God remembered Abraham and sent Lot out into the midst of the overthrow when he overthrew the cities in which Lot had settled. So the rest of this story, which doesn't make the VBS material, right, or the flannel graphs, or even many sermons on the evils of Sodom and Gomorrah, is just like the ending of the story of Noah. Right? Remember that story, right? The son sees the nakedness and goes and tells the brothers, right? Noah's drunk in the tent. Okay. Well, same thing here, right? Noah's in a cave. His daughters get him drunk. Each one of them sleep with Noah, and the offspring become the enemies of Israel, Moabites and the Ammonites. Right? So again, you have a grisly ending to this story, which kind of throws some shade onto Lot, or but you've got this one statement here, right? God remembered Abraham, that there is something about this promise that's made to Abraham that cannot be unseated no matter how bad things get, right? So this whole story of Sodom, grisly as it is the first place, really, well, it's actually, I think, the second place, but it's the first big story that talks to us about this promise of God, right? You have this wicked city, this questionable nephew, this extraction that needs to be made. God's intent is to just wipe the whole thing out, but yet he saves a relative of Abraham, not connected necessarily to the promise, but it's like only as a relation, right? There's that kind of a connection. And so this memory becomes really important about God remembering the promise, right? So God is showing God's faithfulness here. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because God remembering the promise comes up again as a means of saving people. So, for example, we see in the book of Exodus, which is in Exodus 32, the story of the golden calf. The people have been delivered from Egypt. They're out in the wilderness. Moses goes up on the mountain, remember, for 40 days to get the commandments. While God's up on the mountain, the people are feeling abandoned and are reveling around, are Isaacing around the calf, right? There's a connection here, right? I mean, it's a thread, it's a connector. They're dancing around the calf. God gets so angry that God tells Moses that God is going to the word there is devour people, literally consume them, right, in this flame of divine fury, and start over with Moses, right? Now, this is in the Emil Fackenheim was the first author of a book entitled, he was the first one to actually start the study of rereading the Bible in light of the Holocaust. His book, Rereading the Bible, Rereading the Jewish Bible After the Holocaust, came out in 1990, right? And it was the first series of essays to do what we're doing here, right? In that book, he raises the question, he names Sinai as the place where Israel's history almost was not, right? If at least according to the narrative, if God had followed with the fury and wiped the people out, all of those people that had been delivered from Egypt would have died. God would have started over, which, in the view of Holocaust vocabulary, that Exodus would have become a deportation, right? Because the whole point of the Holocaust was to exterminate the Jews from the planet. Something that we first read about God wanting to do out of anger. You see, I mean, the stakes could not be higher. Right? Fackenheim also and he's writing from a Jewish perspective, that the history of Jewish people since Sinai has been one of hovering between a God who delivers and a God who destroys. They live in this balance. Now we see that differently in light of Jesus, right? I mean, I get that. But from a Hebrew Bible perspective, you have this idea that God is delivering, but yet God also destroys, and we as God's people hover in this balance. Now, what changes the hovering to security, right? What gets us from one to the other? Well, it's Moses' argument here. Because when Moses hears this, he says, remember, right? There it is again. Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, Jacob, your servants, how you swore to them by your own self, saying, I will multiply your descendants like the stars of the heaven, and all this land that I have promised I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. Right? God's argument that wins the day is remember the promise. The same thing that saved Lot. Remember the promise. God remembered, right? Now, the kicker here is this last thing. And the Lord changed his mind about the disaster he planned to bring on his people. This is a unique statement, certainly in the Genesis to Deuteronomy. The word changed his mind is the Hebrew word shuv, which means to turn around, right? It's elsewhere translated as repent. That's where repent comes from, right? To change your mind, to turn your mind around. So here you have this really interesting statement about a human causing the Lord to change his plans. This is a really good argument for prayer, by the way. Right? Why pray? Right? Well, you have influence. You know, God is, what does James says? God is able to be entreated, right? Entreated, right? And so you have this intercessory work by Moses here that works on the same basis as many places, and there's other places too that kind of allude to this. Numbers is another one. But the memory of the promise. right, becomes what is key to holding this whole thing together, right? From the time of the promise of Abraham, really until the coming of Christ, right? The going back to the promise. And you'll remember in the Gospel of Matthew, right? Matthew starts the gospel, which is the most Jewish of the Gospels, most Hebrew of the Gospels, starts the genealogy, right? He goes through Abraham to David and on through to Christ, right? So the memory of the promise. Now, here's the other thing that's interesting about this particular part of Exodus is that there are a number of people that actually place the composition of Exodus, and particularly this section of Exodus, as a late one of the latest parts of the Torah to be written or completed. Right? It's an early story, but written later. And one of the things that is argued is that this mention of memory is really all Israel has after Babylonian captivity and the return and the fall and the occupation by Persia, right? That Israel can no longer rely on land because it's not sovereign over any land anymore. It can no longer rely on kings because the kings are all defunct. It can no longer rely on a temple because the temple was destroyed, and even though it was rebuilt, it did not have the former glory of Solomon, right? There's nothing earthly that the people of God known as Israel in the Bible, there's nothing they can rely on to be their marker of salvation, of savior and purpose. The only thing they've got left by these late periods when the Hebrew Bible is actually coalescing into a book or a series of books is the idea of a promise, right? That when all else has failed, which all else did fail, right, from an earthly perspective, the promise still remains. And for me, I find this incredibly compelling about the durability of the promises of God. And this is the thing that made from a Jewish perspective, made the Holocaust so horrific theologically, is that has the promise of God ended, or is it still durable even though all of these horrible things have happened to us, right? And so that's probably, we don't have time to go into all of that today, but I think it's important to see that this moment, certainly Sodom and Gomorrah is the first hint of it, right? It's the first time we see it work through God's remembering Lot, because there's no compelling reason for God to have done that, right? Given the wickedness of Sodom, the fact that Lot chose to live in Sodom, right? There isn't anything that organically connects Lot to the promise made to Abraham, other than Lot simply being a relative. But if God is willing to deliver Sodom or deliver Lot because of the memory of Abraham, it shows how important the promise of Abraham is. And now you see it in full bloom here in Exodus, because this was the moment in Israel's history when the law was given, right? The law came at Sinai. And so today you will have, the kind of the identity of Jewish religion based on law. And again, that there's many different sects of Judaism, so this isn't true for all of them. But for those that that do take the law very seriously, it all goes back to Sinai, right? The tablets, the Ten Commandments, the law given at Sinai. And that wouldn't have happened, according to the story, if God had not remembered the promise. So the promise becomes really important. The promise, the fact that God is faithful to promises, I think becomes really important to us, particularly in those moments when everything else that we think we can rely on vaporizes. Right? I mean, we've all been in places where there's nothing kind of really from a world point of view that we can hold on to feel okay, right? It all just kind of goes like just evaporates. But God's promises don't evaporate. Right. And I think that's the lesson here from all of this, right? Is that God is faithful. Now, I'm not suggesting at all that we can even touch or understand how this is true. But because there are many times, many times that I can only speak for myself, where I don't have any idea where God even is, right? I mean, it's just things have just fallen apart so badly that I can't make sense of anything. But there's this promise, right? And I can read stories about how this promise endured even despite all the reasons it shouldn't have, right? And that can give me hope. That can give us hope. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm going to stop talking and let you reflect. Right. And the reason I'm pushing on this is because I think it is just so critical of any study of the Old Testament. We've got to look at the foundational things on which it's built. You can't just cherry pick stories and make stuff up like we so often do, right? If there's a connection throughout. So, all right, reflection. What do you think? Yes, Scott.
What really strikes me is that Abraham's efforts, his supplication to God made a difference. And
yes.
I don't think that we really think that way really often enough. And the other thing I would say is that you have to remember that his efforts didn't start with only Lot and his family. It was the entire city he wanted to save. Right. And he was trying to spare a whole city. Well, back to the flannel graph idea of this story, when I was growing up, what was communicated to me as a child was that if you look at a group of people that make you uncomfortable in their behavior, you can categorize the entire group. And then the whole idea that Lot's wife looked back meant that you can categorize them and then you can put them out of your mind. And if you don't put them out of your mind, then you get to turned into a pillar of salt. And I guess what I would say is there's an effort to bring grace to a large group of people in the beginning of the story that I think is really important to the rest of us, because we want to categorize everyone, put them out of our mind, walk away and never turn back. And I don't think that's right.
Yeah, that's certainly not what. That's right. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, Aaron.
Well, you were wondering why Lot. And I'm thinking, well, three angels, first of all, three men, angels, whatever you want to call them, appeared to Abraham. And my mind goes, okay, one of them's hanging around with Abraham just to talk, and the other two went to Sodom. Because, and the reason Lot and his family were rescued is because of an even more ancient practice of hospitality.
Yeah.
If he's sitting in the gate of the city, he sees two strangers approach. His first instinct, come with me to my house. You know, and once they come under his once they come under his house, they're under his protection. If something happens to them while they're under his protection, it's his sin, not the people who commit the sin. So
Yeah.
that's why Lot and his family get rescued.
Well, certainly the hospitality of Lot differentiates him from others in Sodom. We can say that. Yeah. Yeah, Laconia?
I'm glad I got rid of the nickname Lot.
Yes.
You understand why?
I do, just to kind of just insert a little bit of funny stuff here. A really good story about, Lot's wife. And there's really a lot of great material written about why she may have turned back. But in my grandparents' church, which is in a small farming community in Texas, I was talking to Laconia about this. It was known as a shotgun church. You ever heard that term? It's when you walk in the building and there's a single aisle that goes right up to the pulpit, right? And then there's pews on either side, so you could literally open the door and point a shot. I mean, it's a horrible term, but I grew up feeling churches and referred to as shotgun churches. But often in these types of churches, above, like if I'm facing the pulpit, above the entry door was a clock, right? And
The good old days.
huh?
Those were the good old days.
Yeah, there was a clock. And the point, according to my grandmother, was that the preacher could look up and see the clock and know when to stop. Right? But over this particular clock, were stenciled, you know, that famous stenciling for Bible class, right? Was stenciled around the clock, remember Lot's wife. Because if you turned your head back to see what time it was, anyway, we're at time, but yeah, Kale, and here you training.
This is more of a curiosity and a question than a point to make. But I often struggle with this story of this is why God did this to the city of Sodom, right? As a narrative or as an understanding for who God is and who God is with his people. And connecting that to the Holocaust or more modern instances of why did this happen to this group of people or this location or whatever, and trying to balance out the message. The point of the scripture is, as we talked about earlier, not a historical, the way that we think of historical, right? Narrative. It is a story about who God is and balancing that against today. And I struggle with that a lot in this story and in similar ones.
Yeah, and I think looking at the function of the story in the wider context helps get out of that kind of framework, right? Because something like Sodom and Gomorrah is kind of a trope, right? It's sort of a stand-in, right? Even in the New Testament, right? The Sodom and Gomorrah get referred to as places of wickedness. It's sort of a marker, right? So that like we might talk about, well, and even in the book of Jonah, right? You know, going to Tarshish, right? Which would have been probably, I think it's someplace in Spain that was sort of like a Las Vegas, you know, so well, even, you know, you say Las Vegas, right? And you automatically, you think of certain things. But if you were actually in Las Vegas and you looked at how it functioned in the wider state of Nevada, you'd had a little bit different, maybe viewpoint. But okay, Laconia, you have the